The doors of the war hall burst open, and Draven Ashgrave went silent in the middle of his own sentence. His hand shot to his head, as if something had struck him from the inside. Every alpha at the long stone table turned to look at him. Generals who had traveled for 3 days to sit at that table froze mid-breath. The candles along the walls flickered as the pack's collective tension rose, because an alpha king did not simply stop speaking. He did not simply gasp and grip the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. Something was wrong, and everyone in that hall could feel it. But Draven was not in pain from a wound. He was hearing a voice. It was not his own voice. It was not the voice of the witch who had haunted his dreams for the past 3 weeks, whispering threats about a curse she promised would ruin him. It was a woman's voice, quiet and steady, and it was not speaking to him. It was speaking inside its own head, the way a person thinks when they believe no one else can hear them. He does not even know I exist. 5 years serving this pack, and he still looks straight through me like I am part of the furniture. Draven turned his head toward the back of the hall, where the servants and healers stood along the wall, present only to refill cups and tend to any injury that might arise during a heated council. His eyes moved from face to face, until they landed on a young woman, standing perfectly still, her arms folded, her expression polite and unreadable. She was watching the council the way everyone else was, waiting for the king to continue. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than any blade could, that the voice in his head belonged to her. 3 weeks earlier, he had turned away a witch named Marin Ash, who had come to his gates, asking for sanctuary from a rival coven. He had refused her, not out of cruelty, but because his pack could not afford to shelter someone hunted by enemies with far more numbers than his own warriors. Marin had not accepted the refusal quietly. She had looked him dead in the eyes, and told him that a king who could not hear the truth from his own people did not deserve to rule them. Then she had vanished into the forest, and he had assumed her threat was nothing more than wounded pride. He now understood she had left him with a curse instead of a wound. Somehow, in some way he did not yet understand, she had bound his mind to another person's thoughts. And judging by the timing, that person had just walked into this hall. Around him, the war council still waited. Kellen Thorne, the alpha from the Western Territory, and the loudest voice pushing for immediate conflict with the northern packs, cleared his throat with obvious impatience. "My king," Kellen said, his tone carrying just enough edge to sound like concern, while hiding something closer to irritation. "You were saying something about troop placement along the eastern ridge." Draven barely heard him. The voice inside his mind kept going, unaware that anyone could hear it. "I wonder what would happen if I just walked out of this room right now. Would anyone even notice? Probably not until they needed someone to clean up after them." A small, tired laugh followed the thought, the kind of laugh a person makes only to themselves, when no one is around to share it with. Draven felt something strange stir in his chest, something between guilt and fascination. This woman, standing quietly against the wall, had thoughts sharper and more honest than anything he had heard from the powerful men seated at his table. He needed time. He needed to think. But more than anything, he needed this council to stop, because he could not focus on decisions that would affect thousands of lives, while a stranger's private thoughts echoed through his skull like a second heartbeat. "The council is finished for tonight," Draven said, his voice steadier than he felt. The room erupted into confused murmurs. Kellen Thorne stood so fast, his chair scraped loudly against the stone floor. "Finished? My king, we have not agreed on anything. The northern packs are gathering forces as we speak. Every day we delay is a day they grow stronger." "I am aware of the situation," Draven said, forcing calm into his tone even as the woman's thoughts continued whispering through his mind, now wondering whether the meeting was ending early, because someone important had said something wrong. "I need to consult the old records before I commit our warriors to any strategy. This is not a decision to make in haste." It was a lie, or at least half of one. There were no old records waiting to be consulted. But it was the only excuse he could form quickly enough to end the meeting before his composure cracked completely in front of every rival and ally gathered in that hall. Another alpha, an older man named Corwin Blackwood, who ruled a smaller territory to the south, studied Draven with narrowed eyes. Corwin had known Draven's father, and had a habit of noticing things other people missed. "Are you unwell, my king?" Corwin asked, his voice low enough that it did not carry to the rest of the room. "You went pale before you spoke." "I am well," Draven answered, though the words felt hollow even to him. "A passing headache. Nothing more." Corwin did not look convinced, but he nodded and said nothing further. The other alphas began to rise from their seats, some grumbling, some exchanging glances that suggested they suspected weakness where there was none, at least not the kind they imagined. Kellen Thorne was the last to leave, pausing at the doorway to give Draven a long look before disappearing into the corridor. Draven remained standing at the head of the table, his hands pressed flat against the cool stone, waiting for the hall to empty. He did not dare look toward the back wall again, afraid that meeting the woman's eyes might somehow make the curse worse, though he had no real understanding of how any of this worked. As the last of the guards filed out, the voice returned, quieter now, almost resigned. "At least it's over. I thought that meeting would never end. I need to check on the wounded scout before I turn in for the night. Poor man has been asking for water every hour." Draven's chest tightened. Even in her private thoughts, when she believed herself completely alone, this woman was thinking of someone else's comfort before her own. He found himself wanting to know more, and that want unsettled him more than the curse itself. He waited until the hall was nearly empty before he allowed himself to move. His personal guard, a broad-shouldered man named Finn Roswell who had served him since childhood, remained near the door, watching him with the quiet concern of someone who had known him long enough to sense when something was wrong. "My king," Finn said carefully. "Should I fetch the healer?" Draven almost laughed at the irony of the question. The healer was precisely the problem, though not in any way Finn could imagine. "No," Draven said. "Find out who was standing near the west wall during the council. The young woman in the pale healer's coat. I want her name." Finn raised an eyebrow, but did not question the order. "Of course, my king." As Finn left to gather the information, Draven sank into his chair and pressed his palms against his eyes. The voice had gone quiet for now, perhaps because the woman had left the hall and was focused on whatever task awaited her. But he knew, with a sinking certainty, that the silence would not last. Sooner or later, her thoughts would return, and he would be forced to listen to every private feeling, every unguarded worry, every small joy or frustration that crossed her mind. It should have felt like an invasion. In many ways, it was one. He had no right to know these things about a stranger, and she had no idea that her most private moments were no longer private at all. But beneath the guilt, something else stirred in him, something he did not want to name yet. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was hearing the truth from someone in his pack, unfiltered by fear of his title or hope for his favor. It was strange and unsettling and, if he was honest with himself, more compelling than anything that had happened in that war hall in years. Finn returned within the hour, his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant he had learned something worth reporting. "Her name is Lyra Voss," Finn said. "She works under the head healer, mostly assisting with wounded scouts and border patrol injuries. Quiet, keeps to herself, well liked by the other healers. Nothing unusual in her record." Nothing unusual, Draven thought, except that she was somehow bound to his mind by a curse neither of them had asked for. "Bring her to my study," Draven said. Quietly, "I do not want this discussed outside these walls." Finn hesitated, clearly curious but too disciplined to ask. "Should I tell her why she is being summoned?" "No," Draven said. "Tell her nothing. I will explain everything myself." As Finn left again, Draven rose from his chair and walked toward the tall window overlooking the training grounds below. Torches burned along the outer wall, and somewhere beyond them, the northern packs were gathering, preparing for a conflict that could reshape the entire region. He should have been thinking about troop numbers and supply lines. He should have been planning how to counter Kellen Thorne's aggressive strategy without provoking a war his pack could not win. Instead, he found himself thinking about a healer named Lyra Voss, wondering what she would say when she learned that the Alpha King had been living inside her thoughts since the moment she walked into that hall. He did not have long to wonder. Within a quarter hour, he heard familiar footsteps approaching from the corridor, followed by a new voice inside his mind, hesitant and slightly nervous. "Why would the king want to see me? I have not done anything wrong. Unless someone complained about the wound dressing I changed this morning. That soldier did seem unhappy about the bandage being too tight." Draven almost smiled despite everything. Whatever came next, whatever explanation he owed her, one thing had already become clear. This curse had shown him more honesty in a single evening than 5 years of ruling had ever offered him, and he was not entirely sure he wanted it to end. The door opened, and Lyra Voss stepped into his study, her eyes wide with confusion and quiet worry, completely unaware that the man standing before her already knew exactly what she was thinking. Lyra stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her, unsure whether to bow or wait for permission to speak. The study was smaller than the war hall, lined with shelves of old books and maps, lit by a single lamp on the desk. It felt private in a way the hall had not, and that privacy only made her more nervous. "You wanted to see me, my king?" she asked, her voice careful, measured in the way people spoke when they were not certain if they were in trouble. Draven studied her for a long moment before answering. He had spent the last quarter hour trying to decide how to explain something that sounded impossible even to him, and he still had not found words that made it sound less strange. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "What I am about to tell you will sound difficult to believe. I ask that you listen fully before you respond." Lyra sat, though her posture remained stiff, her eyes flicking toward the door, as if checking that it was still an option to leave. Even without hearing her thoughts, Draven could read the tension in her shoulders. But he did hear her thoughts, and what she was thinking made his chest tighten with something close to sympathy. "This is it. He is going to dismiss me from the pack. I do not even know what I did." "You have done nothing wrong," Draven said quickly, before he could stop himself. Lyra blinked, startled. "I did not say anything, my king." He realized his mistake immediately. He had responded to a thought she had not spoken aloud, and now there was no way to explain that away as coincidence. He exhaled slowly, and decided the only path forward was the truth, however strange it sounded. "3 weeks ago," he began, "a witch named Marin Ash came to my gates, seeking protection from a rival coven. I turned her away, because sheltering her would have put this entire pack at risk. Before she left, she told me I would regret refusing to hear the truth. I assumed she meant it as a simple threat, the kind of thing people say when they are angry and have no real power to back it up." Lyra's expression shifted from confusion to cautious attention, though she still did not understand where this was going. "I was wrong," Draven continued. "Tonight, during the council, I began hearing a voice in my mind. Not my own thoughts. Someone else's. A stranger's private thoughts, as clear as if they were speaking directly into my ear." He paused, watching her carefully. "That voice belongs to you." For a moment, Lyra said nothing. Her face went through several expressions in quick succession: disbelief, confusion, and then something closer to fear. "That is not possible," she said finally. "You cannot hear my thoughts." "No one can hear another person's thoughts, my king. That is not how curses work, if such things are even real." "I understand why you do not believe me," Draven said. "But I heard you think about the wounded scout who kept asking for water. I heard you wonder if I noticed you standing there. I heard you laugh quietly to yourself when you imagined walking out of the council without anyone noticing." Lyra's face drained of color. Those thoughts had been hers, private and unguarded, thoughts she had never intended for anyone else to know. The realization settled over her slowly, and with it came a wave of humiliation that Draven could feel through the curse itself, sharp and unmistakable. "You heard all of that," she said quietly, more statement than question. "I did not ask for this," Draven said, his voice softer now. "I understand it feels like an intrusion, because it is one. I would not have chosen this for either of us." Lyra stood abruptly, pacing a few steps toward the window before turning back to face him. "How long will this last? Is there a way to reverse it?" "I do not know," Draven admitted. "The witch who cursed me left the territory that same night. I have no way to find her, and even if I did, I do not know if she would agree to remove it, even if she could." Lyra pressed her palms against her eyes for a moment, the way a person does when trying to steady themselves against something overwhelming. When she lowered her hands, her expression had hardened into something more composed, though Draven could still feel the anxiety beneath it through the connection. "So you are telling me," she said slowly, "that for an unknown amount of time, every thought I have, every private worry, every complaint I have never spoken aloud, will be heard by you." the Alpha King, a man I have exchanged perhaps 10 words with in 5 years of service. When she put it that way, the full weight of the situation settled over Draven as well. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was a complete collapse of privacy for a woman who had never asked for any part of this, who had simply been standing in the wrong hall on the wrong evening. Yes, he said, because there was no gentler way to say it. That is what I am telling you. Lyra let out a breath that was somewhere between a laugh and a sound of disbelief. This is absurd. I assist with wound dressings and fever remedies. I am not equipped to deal with curses or kings or any of this. Neither am I equipped to deal with it, Draven said. I have ruled this pack for 5 years, and nothing has prepared me for what happened in that hall tonight. I stopped a war council because I could not focus while your thoughts were running through my mind alongside my own. Every alpha in that room noticed something was wrong, and I do not yet have an explanation that will satisfy them for long. Lyra's eyes widened slightly. You stopped the council because of me? I stopped the council because of the curse, Draven corrected, though even as he said it, he understood the distinction mattered less than it should have. The northern packs are gathering, and my alphas are eager for immediate action. I cannot afford distraction, and yet distraction is exactly what this curse has become. Silence settled between them, heavy and uncertain. Lyra sat back down slowly, her earlier composure replaced by something more thoughtful, as if she were beginning to understand the scale of what they were both facing. What happens now? She asked. It was the same question Draven had been asking himself since the moment the curse took hold, and he still did not have a complete answer. But sitting there, watching her try to process an impossible truth with more calm than most people in his court would have managed, he felt the beginning of an idea take shape. For now, he said, this stays between us. If word spreads that a curse has given me access to someone's private thoughts, every rival alpha in this region will see it as either a weakness to exploit or a weapon to fear. Either way, it puts you in danger, and it puts this pack in danger. Lyra nodded slowly, though her jaw remained tight with tension. And what would you have me do? Pretend nothing has changed while you listen to everything I think? Draven did not have a comfortable answer to that question either, but he offered the only honest one he had. I do not expect you to be comfortable with this. I am not comfortable with it myself. But I need your help to navigate whatever this curse has made of us. Because whether either of us wanted it, we are now connected in a way neither of us can undo. Lyra studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, though Draven could feel the storm of uncertainty behind it. Finally she spoke, her voice quieter than before but steady. I want to be clear about something, my king. I did not ask for this. I have never wanted attention from you, or from anyone in this court. If this curse forces me into your presence, I expect honesty in return, not just about what you hear, but about what you plan to do with it. You have my word, Draven said, and he meant it more sincerely than he had meant most promises he had made in that study over the years. Lyra rose from her chair, smoothing her healer's coat, with hands that were not quite steady. Then I suppose there is nothing left to do tonight, except try to sleep, though I doubt either of us will manage it easily. As she turned toward the door, Draven caught the edge of one more thought slipping through the curse, before she fully closed it off, quiet and reluctant. At least he did not laugh at me. That is something, I suppose. He watched her leave, the door closing softly behind her, and sat alone in the lamplight for a long while afterward, turning over everything that had happened in the space of a single evening. A war waited beyond his walls, gathering strength with every passing day, and now, tangled into that same uncertain future, was a healer named Lyra Voss, whose private thoughts had become the last honest voice left in his entire court. Morning came too quickly for both of them. Draven had barely slept, his mind kept awake, not only by his own worries about the gathering northern packs, but by fragments of Lyra's dreams drifting through the curse like distant echoes. He had not expected the connection to reach into sleep, and the discovery left him unsettled in a way he had not anticipated. If her waking thoughts were no longer private, then perhaps nothing about her remained fully her own anymore, and that thought sat heavily on him as the sun rose over the training grounds. He summoned Finn Roswell before breakfast and gave an order that surprised even his most loyal guard. Lyra Voss is to be reassigned, Draven said. She will serve as my personal healer, effective immediately. Have her belongings moved to the chambers near my study. Finn's eyebrows rose, though he kept his tone respectful. "My king, the head healer will have questions. Lyra has never served in a personal capacity before. This is an unusual request. Tell the head healer it is my decision and requires no further explanation," Draven said. "As for questions from anyone else, I will handle them myself if they arise." Finn nodded, though his expression made it clear he suspected there was more to the story than a simple staffing change. He left to carry out the order, and Draven was alone again with his thoughts, and with the growing awareness that keeping this curse secret was going to require far more effort than he had first imagined. By midday, Lyra arrived at the chambers near his study, her expression tight with barely restrained frustration. The moment she stepped through the door, her thoughts arrived ahead of her spoken words, sharp and unmistakable. "Personal healer. As if I asked for this. As if being pulled from the only work I actually enjoy, and placed under his watch every hour of the day, was somehow a kindness. I did not do this to punish you," Draven said before she could speak, already anticipating the argument that was building in her mind. Lyra crossed her arms, standing just inside the doorway. "Then explain to me how uprooting my entire position within this pack, without so much as a conversation beforehand, is meant to help either of us. Because if we are seen together constantly, without explanation, questions will follow that neither of us can afford," Draven said. "As my personal healer, your presence beside me becomes ordinary. No one will think twice about you accompanying me to council meetings, or standing nearby during my daily duties. It gives us a reason to remain close without revealing the truth." Lyra's jaw tightened, though Draven could feel the anger in her thoughts slowly giving way to reluctant understanding. She did not like the solution, but she could not immediately think of a better one, and that frustrated her almost as much as the situation itself. "You could have asked me first," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "I am not a piece to be moved across a board without a voice in the matter." Draven felt the weight of that fairly delivered criticism settle over him. She was right, and he knew it. In 5 years of ruling, he had grown accustomed to making decisions and expecting them to be carried out without argument. It had never occurred to him, until this very moment, how much that habit resembled exactly the kind of leadership Marin Ash had accused him of the night she left his gates. "You are right," he said. "I should have asked. I am asking now, though perhaps later than I should have. Will you help me navigate this? Not because I have ordered it, but because you are willing?" Lyra studied him for a long moment, clearly surprised by the shift in his tone. Whatever she had expected from this conversation, an apology had not been part of it. "I do not have much choice, given the circumstances," she said eventually. "But I appreciate that you asked, even if it came a little late." The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Lyra moved through her new duties with careful professionalism, tending to minor injuries among the household guard, and keeping close to Draven's side during his daily rounds through the territory. At first, the arrangement felt stiff and forced, each of them acutely aware of the other's presence in a way that made ordinary conversation difficult. But gradually, something began to shift. Draven found himself listening to her thoughts not out of necessity, but out of genuine interest, learning things about her that she would never have volunteered aloud. She worried constantly about the younger healers under her former supervision, hoping they were adjusting well without her guidance. She thought often about her mother, a healer from a neighboring territory who had passed years earlier, and how she still sometimes reached for remedies the way her mother had taught her, as if some part of that lesson kept her close even now. She had opinions about nearly everyone in the pack, opinions she would never have spoken aloud, sharp observations about who could be trusted and who postured more than they served. Draven began to realize that Lyra understood the pack, its people and its undercurrents, better than most of his senior advisors did. She simply had never been given a platform to share what she knew, because no one had ever thought to ask a healer's assistant for her opinion on matters of politics or strategy. One afternoon, as they walked together along the training grounds, watching a group of young warriors practice under Finn's supervision, Draven decided to test something. "What do you think of Kellen Thorne?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. Lyra glanced at him, surprised by the direct question. "That is not something a healer's assistant is usually asked." "You are my personal healer now," Draven said. "And I am asking." She considered the question for a moment, her eyes drifting toward the training grounds as she thought it through. "He pushes hard for war, because war benefits him more than it benefits this pack. His territory borders the north most closely. If conflict breaks out, he stands to gain the most land and the most influence, regardless of how many warriors from other packs are lost in the process. Draven had suspected something similar for months, but had never heard it stated so plainly, without the careful diplomatic hedging his advisors usually wrapped around such observations. He glanced at her, impressed despite himself. "You have thought about this before," he said. "I think about many things," Lyra replied, a faint edge of dry humor entering her voice for the first time since the curse had begun. "Most of them, until recently, I assumed no one would ever hear." Despite the discomfort still lingering beneath their exchanges, moments like these began to soften the tension between them. Draven found himself looking forward to her presence in ways he had not expected, not merely for the honesty of her thoughts, but for the quiet steadiness she brought to a role in his life that had, until now, been filled only with careful performances and political maneuvering. Still, not everything about the arrangement was comfortable. There were moments when Lyra's thoughts turned toward frustration with her new position, moments of doubt about whether she had made the right choice in cooperating so fully, and moments, increasingly, of confusion about the way her feelings toward him had begun to shift from wary distrust into something far more complicated. She guarded those particular thoughts as best she could, pushing them away whenever she noticed them forming, but Draven caught fragments regardless, and he found himself equally unsettled by his own growing awareness of her. It was during one such quiet evening, as she changed the bandage on a minor training injury he had sustained while sparring with Finn, that the tension between them became impossible to ignore. Her hands were careful and precise, her focus entirely on the wound, but her thoughts betrayed something else entirely. "He is watching me again. I wish he would stop, or I wish I did not notice when he does." Draven, caught between amusement and something warmer, allowed himself a small smile. "I am not watching you," he said, though it was only half true. Lyra's hands paused briefly before continuing their work, her cheeks coloring slightly. "You heard that?" "I did," Draven admitted. "This curse is going to be the end of my composure," she muttered, tying off the bandage with more force than necessary. "For what it is worth," Draven said, "I find myself distracted more often than I would like to admit as well." Lyra looked up at him then, something uncertain and searching in her expression, as if she were trying to decide whether his words were simple honesty or something closer to a confession. Neither of them spoke further on the matter that evening, but the air between them had shifted, subtly and unmistakably, into something neither of them fully understood yet, and neither of them was ready to name. The next war council arrived faster than either of them wanted. Word had reached Draven that the northern packs had moved their forces closer to the border, and the pressure from his own alphas to respond had grown too great to delay any longer. This time, when the hall filled with generals and rival leaders, Lyra stood near the back wall once again, but now her presence beside the king carried an official reason, and no one questioned why the personal healer remained close at hand. Kellen Thorne opened the meeting with his usual urgency, spreading a map across the table and pointing to markers representing enemy movement along the eastern ridge. "They grow bolder every day," Kellen said. "If we do not strike first, we hand them the advantage of choosing when and where this conflict begins." Several of the younger alphas murmured in agreement, clearly swayed by the aggressive tone Kellen had cultivated over the past several meetings. Draven studied the map, searching for the flaw he knew had to exist somewhere in the argument, but the strategy on the surface seemed sound enough to be dangerous. Then Lyra's thoughts arrived, quiet and focused, carrying an observation Draven would never have reached on his own. "That is not the full troop count. He is leaving out the reinforcements stationed along the southern pass, the ones that arrived only 2 days ago. If they strike where he suggests, those reinforcements will flank our warriors from behind, before the first exchange even finishes." Draven's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at the map again, this time searching specifically for the gap Lyra's thoughts had identified. It took him a moment, but he found it. A section of the southern territory left conspicuously unmarked, an area his scouts had reported unusual activity in only days earlier. "What of the reinforcements along the southern pass?" Draven asked, keeping his tone even. "The scouting reports from 2 days ago mentioned unusual movement in that region. Your map does not account for them." Kellen's expression flickered, just for a moment, before settling back into practiced confidence. A minor detail. Nothing that changes the overall strategy. A minor detail that could flank our warriors if we strike where you suggest, Draven said, watching Kellen closely now. I would like a full accounting of enemy positions before this council commits to any plan of attack. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Kellen's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, something sharp and calculating passed behind his eyes, before he forced a smile back into place. Of course, my king. I will have updated reports prepared by tomorrow. The council continued for another hour, but the momentum toward immediate conflict had shifted, replaced by a more cautious approach that Draven guided carefully, drawing on Lyra's silent observations each time the discussion threatened to lean too heavily on assumptions rather than facts. By the time the meeting ended, several of the alphas who had entered the hall convinced war was the only option now left, with more questions than certainty, exactly as Draven had hoped. As the hall emptied, Corwin Blackwood lingered near the doorway, watching Draven with the same careful attention he had shown during the previous council. You have grown sharper these past few days, my king, Corwin said, his tone thoughtful rather than suspicious. Whatever headache troubled you before seems to have cleared. Perhaps I simply needed a better perspective, Draven replied, glancing briefly toward the back wall where Lyra stood gathering her supplies. Corwin followed his gaze, and something in his expression suggested he noticed more than he let on, though he said nothing further before departing. Draven made a mental note to be more careful about where his attention wandered during future meetings, aware that Corwin's sharp instincts had served him well for decades, and were unlikely to miss significant patterns for long. Once the hall was empty, Lyra approached, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering tension. That was closer than I would have liked, she said quietly. If Kellen realizes someone is feeding you information he does not want revealed, he will grow more careful about hiding his intentions. He already suspects something, Draven admitted. But suspicion is not proof, and until he has proof, there is little he can do. Lyra crossed her arms, her expression thoughtful. You should be careful all the same. Men like Kellen do not need proof to cause trouble. Suspicion alone is often enough for someone willing to act on it. Her warning settled uncomfortably in Draven's chest, not because he doubted her judgment, but because he suspected she was right. Kellen Thorne had built his influence through careful manipulation and calculated risk, and a king who suddenly seemed capable of predicting his every move would not go unnoticed for long, regardless of how the change had come about. Over the following days, the pattern continued. Each council meeting, each private negotiation with visiting alphas, each moment of tension within his own court, Draven found himself guided by the quiet honesty of Lyra's thoughts, catching details others missed, understanding motivations others failed to see. His decisions grew sharper, his instincts more reliable, and slowly, the pack's confidence in his leadership began to strengthen in ways it had not in years. But with every improvement in his rule, came a corresponding increase in the attention paid to Lyra's presence at his side. Servants began to whisper about the personal healer who never seemed to leave the king's company. Warriors exchanged curious glances whenever she accompanied him to the training grounds, and somewhere within the pack, word of these whispers eventually found its way to Kellen Thorne, a man who had built his entire strategy around noticing the details other people overlooked. Draven did not yet know how closely Kellen was watching, nor how quickly the Western Alpha's suspicion was hardening into something far more dangerous than idle curiosity. He was too focused on the growing connection between himself and Lyra, too absorbed in the strange comfort of finally having someone in his court whose honesty he could trust completely, to notice the storm quietly gathering just beyond his sight. For now, the pack believed peace remained possible. The northern packs remained cautious rather than aggressive, and Draven allowed himself, for the first time in years, to feel something close to hope. It would not last much longer, but in that fragile stretch of calm, he found himself grateful for a curse he had once considered nothing but a burden. 2 weeks passed before the fragile calm within the pack began to show cracks that had nothing to do with the northern territories. The change came gradually, in small moments neither Draven nor Lyra fully noticed, until they had already grown accustomed to them. She no longer waited for permission before offering her opinion during private discussions. He no longer hesitated before seeking her out, simply to hear her thoughts on matters that had nothing to do with strategy or war. One evening, after a long day spent reviewing supply reports for the border patrols, Draven found himself walking with Lyra, through the quiet garden behind the main hall, a place he rarely visited, but had begun to favor for its stillness. The northern conflict remained unresolved, but for the moment, the pressing urgency had eased enough to allow both of them a rare pocket of calm. "You have not asked me about my family," Lyra said suddenly, breaking a comfortable silence that had settled between them as they walked past rows of late-blooming flowers. Draven glanced at her, surprised by the shift in conversation. "I assumed it was not my place to ask, given everything else this curse has already taken from you." Lyra's expression softened, though something heavier moved behind her eyes. "My mother was a healer, much like I am now. She taught me everything I know about herbs and remedies before I ever set foot in a formal healer's hall. She died during a border conflict when I was younger, caught in territory that should have been safe." Draven felt the weight of her memory pressing gently against the curse, fragments of grief he had caught before in passing thoughts but had never fully understood until now. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I did not know." "There was no reason for you to know," Lyra said, though her tone carried no bitterness, only quiet acceptance. "I do not often speak of it, but I suppose, given everything you already hear, whether I wish it or not, it felt strange to keep it entirely hidden." They walked in silence for a while longer, the evening air cool and calm around them. Draven found himself thinking about his own losses, the father he had lost too young, the responsibilities that had fallen onto his shoulders long before he felt ready to carry them. He had never spoken about these things freely with anyone in his court, not even Finn, who had known him the longest. "My father died when I was 19, Draven said eventually, the words coming slower than he expected. "I became Alpha King before I had finished learning how to be a person, let alone a leader. Most days, I still feel as though I am guessing." Lyra turned to look at him, something gentle and understanding softening her expression. "For what it is worth, from everything I have heard these past weeks, both from your decisions and from your own private thoughts, you guess far better than you give yourself credit for." The compliment settled warmly in his chest, more meaningful somehow because it came from someone who had no reason to flatter him, someone whose honesty he had already learned to trust completely. He studied her for a long moment, the moonlight catching the edges of her expression, and felt something shift firmly into place within him, something he had been resisting acknowledging since the very first night the curse had taken hold. "I care for her, not simply because the curse forces us together, because of who she is." He had not meant to think it so clearly, so directly, but the thought slipped free before he could stop it, and though the curse did not carry his own thoughts to her, the way hers carried to him, something in his expression must have revealed more than he intended. Lyra's breath caught softly, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Draven," she said quietly, using his name without title, for the first time since the curse had begun. "We should be careful. Whatever this is between us, it complicates everything already difficult about our situation." "I know," he admitted, "but I find myself unwilling to pretend it does not exist, regardless of how complicated it becomes." Lyra did not answer immediately, her gaze drifting toward the garden's edge, where the wall separating the private grounds from the rest of the territory rose in the darkness. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. "I have spent 5 years in this pack, believing I was invisible to everyone who mattered. Now the most powerful man in this territory tells me he hears my every thought and still chooses to stand beside me, rather than dismiss me. It is difficult to know how to feel about that, Draven. Grateful, frightened, and something else entirely, all at once." "You are allowed to feel all of those things," Draven said. "I certainly do." A faint, uncertain smile crossed her face, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since the curse began. "Perhaps we simply continue forward then, and see where this leads us, curse and all." It was not a declaration of anything permanent, but it was enough for that moment, a quiet agreement between two people who had been thrown together by circumstances neither of them controlled, yet who had found, against every expectation, something worth protecting in each other. Their peace, however fragile, would not last uninterrupted. Even as they stood together in the quiet garden, unaware of anything beyond their own conversation, a shadow moved along the outer wall of the training grounds, close enough to have overheard fragments of their exchange. Kellen Thorne had grown tired of waiting for proof to fall into his hands naturally. He had decided, days earlier, to seek it out himself. What he had just witnessed in that garden was not proof of a curse. Not exactly. But it was proof of something far more useful to a man like him, a vulnerability in the king's composure that had never existed before Lyra Voss entered his life, and vulnerabilities, in Kellen's experience, were always worth exploiting eventually. He slipped away from the wall as quietly as he had approached, already turning over the possibilities in his mind, calculating how best to use what he had seen to serve his own ambitions. Neither Draven nor Lyra noticed his departure, too absorbed in the fragile new understanding they had just reached to sense the danger already beginning to close in around them. Kellen Thorne did not move quickly. Patience had always served him better than haste, and he understood that whatever he had witnessed in the garden needed careful investigation before he could use it to his advantage. Over the following days, he began asking quiet questions among the servants, framing his curiosity as simple concern for the king's well-being, rather than the calculated search it truly was. He learned that Lyra Voss had been reassigned from the General Healer's Hall to a personal position at the king's side, with almost no explanation given, an unusual decision that had raised eyebrows even among the household staff. He learned that Draven's sudden improvement in strategic thinking had begun on the very same evening as that reassignment. And he learned, from a nervous kitchen servant who had noticed far more than she likely should have, that the king often paused mid-conversation, as though listening to something no one else could hear, always in moments when Lyra happened to be nearby. None of these details alone proved anything unusual. Together, they painted a picture Kellen found difficult to ignore. He brought his suspicions, carefully worded to avoid outright accusation, to Corwin Blackwood during a private conversation following one of the smaller council meetings. "Have you noticed," Kellen began, his tone deliberately casual, "how closely the king keeps his new healer? It seems an unusual arrangement for someone of her position." Corwin, who had already harbored his own quiet suspicions since the night of the first interrupted council, studied Kellen carefully before responding. He had known Kellen long enough to recognize when the Western Alpha was fishing for information, rather than simply making conversation. "The king is entitled to choose his personal healer as he sees fit," Corwin said evenly. "I see no reason to question his decision." "Of course not," Kellen replied, though his tone carried a note of skepticism he made no effort to fully hide. "I only wonder whether there is more to the arrangement than simple healing duties. The king's decisions have grown remarkably sharp since her arrival, almost as if he has gained access to information the rest of us do not have." Corwin's expression remained neutral, though internally, he found himself considering the possibility more seriously than he wanted to admit. He had noticed the same pattern, the sudden improvement in Draven's strategic thinking, the way his attention seemed to drift toward the back of the hall during council meetings. But Corwin had also known Draven's father, had watched the young king grow into his responsibilities over 5 difficult years, and he was not eager to assume the worst without clearer evidence. "Whatever advantage the king has gained," Corwin said carefully, "it has served this pack well. I would think twice before pursuing suspicions that could destabilize a leadership that has finally begun to strengthen." Kellen said nothing further on the matter, but the seed had been planted, and Corwin found himself watching Draven and Lyra with new attention during the following weeks, no longer simply out of protective instinct but out of genuine curiosity about what exactly connected them so completely. Meanwhile, Kellen pursued a different approach entirely. Unsatisfied with indirect suspicion, he began seeking out information about the witch Marin Ash, quietly asking questions among traveling merchants and border scouts who might have crossed paths with her during her exile from the territory. It took nearly 2 weeks of careful inquiry before he finally located a trader who claimed to have seen a woman matching Marin's description in a settlement 2 days' journey to the east. Kellen traveled there himself, using the excuse of border negotiations to explain his absence from the pack's usual affairs. What he found, after some careful searching and a substantial payment for information, confirmed everything he had begun to suspect. Marin Ash, still bitter over her rejection at the Alpha King's gates, was more than willing to speak of the curse she had placed upon him, though she offered the information carefully, clearly aware of its value, and unwilling to share it without something in return. "He refused to protect me when I needed shelter," Marin said, her voice carrying old resentment that had not faded with time. "I bound his mind to the thoughts of the first person he encountered, who mattered to that pack, someone whose honesty he had never bothered to hear. I did not choose her specifically." The curse simply needed a connection, and she happened to be standing close enough when it activated. "Can it be reversed?" Kellen asked, careful to keep his tone neutral despite the excitement building beneath his composure. Marin considered the question for a long moment before answering. "It can be, though the method is not simple. The curse will break entirely if the bond between them ends by force, if the connection is severed, rather than allowed to fade naturally through affection. Remove the woman from his life permanently, and the curse breaks with her absence." The implication behind her words was clear enough that Kellen did not need further explanation. He thanked Marin for her information, offered payment as promised, and began the journey back toward his own territory with a plan already forming in his mind, one that would either secure his ambitions completely or destroy them, depending on how carefully he executed it. He did not intend to harm Lyra Voss directly, at least not yet. Violence carried too much risk of exposure and retaliation from a king who, curse or not, remained a formidable leader in his own right. Instead, Kellen began considering quieter methods, ways to remove her influence from Draven's life without drawing suspicion directly to himself, methods that would leave the king weakened and vulnerable at precisely the moment Kellen intended to press his advantage in the ongoing negotiations with the Northern Pax. Unaware of the danger gathering against her, Lyra continued her days at Draven's side, growing more comfortable with the strange rhythm their lives had settled into. She did not know that a rival alpha now held proof of the very secret she and Draven had worked so carefully to protect, nor did she understand how quickly that knowledge could unravel the fragile peace they had both begun to build. The northern conflict remained the most visible threat facing the pack, but a far more personal danger had already begun moving quietly into position, waiting for the right moment to strike at the one vulnerability capable of bringing an alpha king to his knees. Kellen returned to the territory a week later, careful to disguise his absence as a routine visit to negotiate grazing rights along the western border. He said nothing of his discovery to anyone, not even Corwin, understanding that the fewer people who knew the truth, the more control he retained over how and when it would be revealed. His first move was subtle. During a gathering meant to welcome visiting delegates from a smaller allied pack, Kellen approached Lyra directly, for the first time since the curse had begun, his manner polished and friendly, in a way that immediately put her on edge. "Lyra Voss," he said, offering a slight bow that felt performative rather than genuine. "I have heard a great deal about the king's talented new healer. It seems your skills have made quite an impression." "I only do my duty," Lyra replied carefully, aware of the careful way his eyes studied her, searching for something she could not quite identify. "Of course," Kellen said, his smile never wavering, "though I confess, I find it curious how quickly the king's decisions improved after your arrival at his side, almost as though you offer him something beyond simple healing." The comment landed with precise intent, and Lyra felt a cold spike of alarm rush through her chest, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. Draven, standing several feet away in conversation with one of the visiting delegates, caught the sudden shift in her thoughts immediately. "He knows. Or he suspects enough to be dangerous. I need to warn Draven the moment this gathering ends." Draven excused himself from his conversation as quickly as courtesy allowed, moving toward Lyra and Kellen with practiced calm, though his own thoughts churned with sudden urgency beneath the surface. "Kellen," Draven said, his tone carefully controlled, "I trust you are enjoying the gathering." "Immensely," Kellen replied smoothly. "I was just complimenting your healer on her remarkable talents. It seems she has a gift for improving outcomes far beyond simple wound care." The implication hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, and Draven understood immediately that Kellen was testing them, watching closely for any reaction that might confirm his suspicions. He forced his expression to remain neutral, though internally, he felt the same cold alarm that had gripped Lyra only moments before. "She is skilled at many things," Draven replied evenly. "I am fortunate to have her services." Kellen's smile sharpened slightly, though he said nothing further, excusing himself with another shallow bow, before moving off to mingle with the other guests. Draven watched him go, his jaw tight with barely restrained tension. "He knows something," Lyra said quietly once Kellen was out of earshot. "He suspects something," Draven corrected, though the distinction felt increasingly thin. Whether he has proof is another matter entirely. They did not have long to wonder. 2 days later, Kellen requested a private audience with Draven, framing the request as an urgent matter concerning border security. Draven agreed, though he entered the meeting with careful wariness, aware that whatever Kellen intended to discuss likely had little to do with actual border concerns. Kellen wasted no time once the study door closed behind them. "I know about the curse," he said plainly, watching Draven's face for any flicker of confirmation. "I spoke with the witch who placed it. Marin Ash was quite willing to share the details, once properly compensated for her trouble." Draven's expression hardened, though he said nothing immediately, calculating how much damage had already been done and how much further Kellen intended to press. "I do not know what you are referring to," Draven said finally, though the denial sounded weak even to his own ears. "Do not insult us both by pretending otherwise," Kellen said, his patience thinning now that the truth had finally been spoken aloud between them. "I know you hear her thoughts. I know it began the night you turned Marin away from your gates. And I know precisely how the curse can be broken." Draven's blood ran cold at the implication behind those final words. "What do you want, Kellen?" "Nothing unreasonable," Kellen said, settling into the chair across from Draven's desk, with the ease of a man who believed he now held complete control over the conversation. "Full support for immediate action against the Northern Pacts, without further delay or debate in council. In exchange, I keep what I know to myself." "And if I refuse?" Draven asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Then, every Alpha in this territory learns that their king has been guided, not by his own judgment, but by a curse, binding him to the private thoughts of a healer's assistant," Kellen said. "How much confidence do you imagine they will place in your leadership once they understand the truth? And how safe do you imagine Lyra Voss will remain, once every ambitious rival in this region realizes she holds the key to controlling an Alpha King?" The threat was unmistakable, and Draven felt fury rise sharply within him, though he forced himself to remain outwardly composed. Kellen was not simply threatening exposure. He was threatening Lyra's safety directly, understanding correctly that this was the one vulnerability capable of forcing Draven's hand completely. "You would risk destabilizing this entire pack for your own ambition," Draven said, his voice low and dangerous. "I would risk nothing," Kellen replied calmly. "You are the one choosing whether this remains between us or becomes public knowledge. The choice, as always, belongs to you, my king." Draven's mind raced through every possible option, none of them offering a clean resolution. Agreeing to Kellen's demands meant committing his pack to a war strategy he genuinely believed was reckless, one that could cost countless lives for the sake of Kellen's personal ambition. Refusing meant exposing the curse publicly, placing Lyra in immediate danger from rivals who would see her as either a weapon to control or a threat to eliminate. "I need time to consider this," Draven said finally. "You have 3 days," Kellen replied, rising from his chair with the satisfied air of a man who believed he had already won. "After that, I will assume your silence means you have chosen exposure over cooperation, and I will act accordingly." He left the study without another word, leaving Draven alone with the full weight of an impossible decision settling heavily over him. Somewhere within the household, Lyra's thoughts reached him faintly through the curse, distracted with routine duties, unaware of the danger that had just been placed directly at her doorstep. Draven knew he could not keep this from her much longer. Whatever choice he made in the coming days would affect her as much as it affected him, and she deserved to understand exactly what danger Kellen Thorne's ambition had just brought crashing into both of their lives. Draven found Lyra in the small workroom she used to prepare remedies, surrounded by neatly organized jars of dried herbs and folded linens. She looked up when he entered, her expression shifting immediately from routine focus to concern as she registered the tension written plainly across his face. "Something happened," she said, setting down the mortar and pestle she had been using. It was not a question. Draven closed the door behind him, ensuring their conversation would remain private, before recounting everything Kellen had revealed during their meeting. He watched Lyra's expression change as he spoke, moving through disbelief, fear, and finally a hardened resolve that reminded him once again why he had come to trust her judgment so completely. "He wants you to commit this pack to a war you do not believe in," Lyra said once he finished, "or he exposes the curse and puts me directly in danger. Those are the only options he has given you." "Those are the options he believes he has given me," Draven corrected. "I do not intend to accept either one without exploring other possibilities first." What other possibilities exist? Lyra asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer might be limited. Draven paced toward the window, considering the problem from every angle he could imagine. I could expose the curse myself, before Kellen has the chance to control how the information spreads. If I present it honestly to the council, framed as the misfortune it truly is, rather than something shameful to hide, perhaps I retain enough trust to weather the revelation, without losing my authority entirely. Lyra's eyes widened slightly at the suggestion. That would mean admitting publicly that you hear my thoughts. Every private moment we have shared since this began would become common knowledge among the entire council. I know, Draven said quietly. I would not make this decision lightly, and I would not make it without your agreement. This affects you as much as it affects me, perhaps more, given how much more you stand to lose if the council reacts poorly. Lyra was silent for a long moment, considering the weight of what he was proposing. Finally she spoke, her voice steady despite the uncertainty clearly still present beneath it. If Kellen already knows, and if Marin Ash was willing to share the truth with him for the right price, there is no guarantee the secret remains contained, even if we comply with his demands. He could still reveal it later, whenever it serves his interests to do so. That is precisely what concerns me, Draven admitted. Cooperating with him buys temporary safety at best, and it costs this pack a war I do not believe we can win cleanly. Exposing the truth ourselves carries immediate risk, but it removes Kellen's leverage entirely. He has nothing left to threaten us with once the secret is no longer a secret at all. Lyra crossed the small room to stand closer to him, her expression thoughtful rather than fearful now, though the fear had not entirely disappeared from her thoughts, which Draven could still feel humming quietly beneath her composed exterior. If you choose to reveal this, she said, I want to stand beside you when you do it, not hidden away for protection, but present, as someone who has helped guide this pack through the past several weeks, regardless of how the curse began. Draven studied her closely, admiration mixing with the concern he still felt for her safety. Are you certain? Once this becomes known, there is no returning to the quiet life you had before. You will become a target for anyone who resents the influence you hold over my decisions, curse or not. I have spent 5 years being overlooked, Lyra said. I would rather face difficulty as someone who is seen and understood than continue hiding a truth that could put us both in greater danger later. Besides, she added, a faint smile touching her lips despite the seriousness of the moment, you already told me you would not make this decision without me. I am simply holding you to that promise. Draven felt something steady and certain settle into place within him, the fear that had gripped him since Kellen's threat loosening slightly in the face of her quiet courage. Whatever came next, he would not face it alone, and neither would she. Then we present this to the full council, he said. Not just Kellen, not just Corwin, but everyone gathered for the next war meeting. We control the narrative before he has the chance to twist it into something designed to destroy us both. Over the following 2 days, they prepared carefully, anticipating every possible reaction from the assembled alphas and generals, considering how best to frame a truth that would sound impossible to anyone who had not witnessed the past several weeks firsthand. Draven consulted quietly with Finn, whose loyalty remained unwavering, despite his evident surprise at the full explanation. He also approached Corwin privately, sensing that the older alpha's support, earned through years of careful trust, might prove valuable when the moment came to face the wider council. Corwin listened to the explanation with the same careful attention he brought to every serious matter, his expression unreadable, until Draven finished speaking. I suspected something unusual was happening, Corwin said finally. I did not imagine it was quite this extraordinary, but I have watched your leadership improve steadily since Lyra Voss entered your service, regardless of the strange circumstances behind it. That improvement speaks for itself, curse or no curse. Will you support us when this becomes known to the full council? Draven asked. Corwin considered the question seriously before answering. I will speak honestly about what I have observed. Beyond that, the council will decide for itself what to make of the truth. But you have my support in bringing it forward honestly, rather than allowing Kellen to control how the story unfolds. It was not a guarantee of complete safety, but it was more than Draven had dared to hope for only days earlier. With Corwin's cautious support secured, and with Lyra standing steady beside him, despite everything the coming revelation threatened to cost her, Draven finally felt ready to face the council, and the truth he could no longer keep hidden, regardless of how uncertain the outcome remained. The war hall filled quickly on the appointed evening, every alpha and senior general gathering under the assumption that Draven intended to finally announce his decision regarding the northern conflict. Kellen Thorne arrived with visible confidence, clearly believing the 3 days he had given Draven would end exactly as he had planned, either with full support for his aggressive strategy or with the satisfaction of watching the king's authority crumble under public exposure. He had not anticipated that Draven would choose exposure himself, on his own terms, before Kellen ever had the chance to speak. Lyra stood beside Draven at the head of the table, rather than along the back wall, a placement that immediately drew curious glances from the assembled alphas, who understood without needing to be told that something unusual was about to unfold. Kellen's confident expression flickered slightly as he registered the shift, though he said nothing, apparently deciding to wait and see how Draven intended to proceed. "Before we discuss the northern territories," Draven began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "there is a matter I must address honestly, one that has influenced my leadership these past several weeks, and deserves full transparency before this council." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him with growing curiosity. "Weeks ago, a witch I refused sanctuary placed a curse upon me," Draven continued. "Since that night, I have heard the private thoughts of Lyra Voss, my personal healer, without either of us choosing this connection, or having any means to reverse it. I share this truth now, openly, because I would rather you hear it from me directly than allow it to be twisted into something it is not, by anyone seeking personal advantage from its concealment." Murmurs spread rapidly through the hall, alphas exchanging startled glances, some clearly skeptical, others watching Draven with newfound curiosity, rather than doubt. Kellen's expression had hardened considerably, his carefully laid plan unraveling in real time, as Draven took control of the narrative he had intended to dictate himself. "This is difficult to believe, my king," one of the visiting alphas said cautiously. "Curses of this nature are rare, and proof of such a thing seems impossible to offer." "I understand the skepticism," Draven said. "I would have shared it myself, before experiencing it firsthand, but I did not bring this forward to ask for blind belief. I bring it forward because it explains the improvements many of you have noticed in my strategic decisions these past weeks, improvements that came not from deception or manipulation, but from finally having access to honest insight I had been missing for far too long." Corwin Blackwood spoke next, his voice carrying the weight of years of respected leadership within the region. "I can attest that the king's decisions have grown notably sharper since Lyra Voss began accompanying him. Whatever the cause, the result has served this pack well. I see no reason to punish honesty simply because the truth behind it sounds unusual." Several other alphas nodded slowly, considering Corwin's words carefully. The tension in the room remained thick, but the outright hostility Draven had feared had not yet materialized, replaced instead by cautious curiosity, as the assembled leaders weighed what they had just heard. Kellen, sensing his advantage slipping away entirely, finally spoke, his composure cracking slightly beneath frustration he could no longer fully hide. "And how convenient that the king reveals this only now, after weeks of concealment, rather than when the curse first began. One might wonder what other motivations lie behind such carefully timed honesty." "I reveal it now," Draven said, turning to face Kellen directly, "because you threatened to use this same information to force this pack into a war I do not believe serves our interests, and to endanger a woman who has done nothing but serve this pack faithfully since her arrival. I would rather face this council's judgment honestly than allow my leadership to be controlled through threats made in private." The accusation landed heavily, and the room's attention shifted immediately toward Kellen, whose confident mask had fully slipped away now, replaced by something closer to cornered anger. Several alphas exchanged uneasy glances, clearly reconsidering their earlier trust in Kellen's aggressive war strategy in light of this new revelation about his methods. "You would take the word of a cursed king over the concerns of a loyal alpha who has only ever wanted what is best for this region," Kellen said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "I would take the word of a king who chose honesty over concealment," Corwin replied evenly, "over an alpha who chose threats over honest discussion. That choice speaks clearly enough on its own, Kellen." The room's mood had shifted decisively now, sympathy and respect building steadily toward Draven's honesty, rather than toward Kellen's earlier aggressive posturing. Recognizing that his position had become untenable, Kellen made one final attempt to salvage his standing, though his words carried little of their earlier weight. This council deserves to know that a curse, however honestly revealed, still means the king's judgment has been influenced by forces beyond his control. That is not a small matter to dismiss simply because he chose to admit it publicly. My judgment has been influenced by honest counsel, Draven said firmly. Counsel I was too blind to seek from the right sources before this curse forced me to listen more carefully. If hearing the truth from someone in my own pack makes my leadership weaker in your eyes, Kellen, then perhaps the weakness you fear most is not the curse itself, but a king who can no longer be manipulated by those seeking their own advantage. Silence followed his words, heavy and absolute, before Corwin began to nod slowly, followed by several other alphas around the table. Kellen, recognizing that the council's support had turned decisively away from him, gathered what remained of his composure, and excused himself from the hall without further argument, his earlier plan left in complete ruin. Lyra remained beside Draven throughout the exchange, her presence steady despite the weight of every eye that had turned toward her during the revelation. Once Kellen departed, the remaining alphas turned their attention toward the actual matter of the northern conflict, now approaching the discussion with a caution and thoroughness that had been missing during earlier meetings dominated by Kellen's aggressive urgency. By the time the council finally concluded, hours later, a more measured strategy had taken shape, one focused on careful negotiation, backed by defensive preparation, rather than immediate aggressive action. It was not a perfect resolution, but it was a stronger foundation than anything the pack had built in the weeks since the northern packs first began gathering along the border. As the hall slowly emptied, Corwin paused beside Draven and Lyra, offering a respectful nod toward them both. That took considerable courage, my king, both of you. It was necessary, Draven said. Whatever comes next, I would rather face it honestly than allow fear of exposure to control every decision I make. Corwin's gaze shifted briefly toward Lyra, before returning to Draven. See that you continue listening to good counsel, curse or otherwise. This pack has clearly benefited from it. He departed with the last of the alphas, leaving Draven and Lyra alone in the now quiet hall, the weight of everything that had just happened settling slowly around them. Lyra exhaled a long breath, some of the tension finally easing from her shoulders. That went better than I feared it might, she said. Better than I dared hope, Draven agreed, relief evident in his voice for the first time in days. Kellen's influence within the council has weakened considerably. I do not believe he will find it easy to rally support against us after tonight. And the curse remains, Lyra said quietly, glancing toward him. Whatever comes next, we still face it together, however long it lasts. Draven reached for her hand, an act he would not have dared only weeks earlier, and found her fingers closing around his without hesitation. However long it lasts, he agreed. I find myself increasingly unwilling to wish it away entirely. The weeks following the council's revelation brought changes neither Draven nor Lyra had fully anticipated. Word of the curse spread quickly beyond the war hall, reaching every corner of the pack, and eventually the neighboring territories as well. Some viewed the story with skepticism, assuming exaggeration or rumor had inflated a simpler truth into something more dramatic. Others viewed it with quiet wonder, a tale of an alpha king humbled enough to admit his own limitations, and strengthened by finally listening to a voice he might otherwise have ignored entirely. Kellen Thorne's influence continued to fade in the months that followed. Without the leverage of a secret to hold over Draven, and with the council's trust firmly shifted toward more measured leadership, his aggressive push for war lost the momentum it once carried. Negotiations with the northern packs, guided by careful strategy rather than reckless urgency, eventually produced a fragile but genuine peace, one built on compromise rather than conquest. It was not a perfect resolution, but it held, and lives that might otherwise have been lost to unnecessary conflict were spared instead. Lyra remained at Draven's side throughout the negotiations, her insight proving invaluable during discussions that required reading unspoken tension and hidden motivation as much as they required formal diplomacy. The pack, having witnessed the strength her honesty brought to their king's leadership, gradually came to see her not as an unusual curiosity forced into proximity with the throne, but as someone who had earned her place there through genuine contribution. Their relationship deepened slowly, shaped by the strange intimacy the curse had forced upon them from the very beginning. There were still difficult moments, times when Lyra wished fiercely for a single private thought free from his awareness, times when Draven caught himself wondering whether what grew between them would have blossomed at all without the curse's initial push. But more often than not, those moments gave way to a deeper understanding. Forged through months of unfiltered honesty, neither of them could have built through ordinary courtship alone. Then, nearly 6 months after the curse first took hold, a stranger arrived at the Pax gates, requesting an audience with the king. Draven recognized her immediately, despite the passage of time. Marin Ash stood at the entrance, older and more weathered than he remembered, though the sharp intelligence in her eyes remained unchanged. He met with her privately, Lyra beside him, as she had been through nearly every significant moment since the curse began. "I heard how you handled the truth I gave you," Marin said, studying Draven with something between curiosity and grudging respect. Most men, faced with such a curse, would have hidden it, used it in secret, or let it destroy them entirely. You did neither. "I did not have much choice," Draven said honestly. "Hiding it nearly cost us far more than the truth ever did." Marin's gaze shifted toward Lyra, studying her with careful attention. "And you, healer, how have you found these past months, bound so completely to a king's mind?" "Difficult," Lyra admitted honestly, "but not without value. I have learned things about myself and about him that I doubt either of us would have discovered otherwise." Marin nodded slowly, something almost like satisfaction crossing her weathered features. "The burrito was cold. I did not place this curse expecting it to lead here. I intended punishment, not partnership. But curses, like most things born from anger, rarely unfold exactly as their makers imagine." "Can it be reversed?" Draven asked, though the question carried less urgency now than it might have months earlier. "It can," Marin said. "The threads holding it in place have weakened considerably these past months. Genuine affection tends to soften even the sharpest curses over time. I could sever the remaining connection now, if that is truly what you both wish." Draven glanced toward Lyra, searching her expression for any hint of the answer she preferred, though after everything they had shared, he found himself unable to read whether she hoped for freedom from the curse or something else entirely. For the first time in months, her thoughts remained curiously quiet, as if she were choosing her next words carefully, rather than allowing them to slip freely toward him. "What would you choose?" Lyra asked Marin, "if the choice were yours instead?" Marin considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "I would choose whichever path felt less like loss and more like living honestly with what remains. But that answer belongs to the two of you, not to me." Silence stretched between them, as Draven and Lyra turned to face each other, the weight of the decision settling heavily in the quiet study around them. Draven spoke first, his voice steady despite the uncertainty of the moment. "I have grown accustomed to hearing your honesty," he said. "I do not know if that makes me selfish for wanting to keep it, or simply certain of what I have found in you these past months." Lyra's expression softened, and for the first time since Marin's arrival, a thought slipped gently through the curse, unguarded and warm. "I do not think I want it to end either, whatever that says about either of us." Draven felt the words settle warmly into his chest, and though he said nothing aloud in response, the small, certain smile that crossed his face told her clearly enough that he had heard, and that he shared exactly the same quiet hope. Turning back to Marin, Draven spoke with newfound clarity. "We choose to let it remain, for now, not because we fear the alternative, but because we have found something worth keeping, in what your curse first forced upon us." Marin studied them both for a long moment before offering a small, knowing nod. "Then I will leave you to it. Perhaps, in time, the connection will fade naturally on its own, once trust no longer requires such constant confirmation, or perhaps it will remain exactly as it is. Either way, the choice belongs entirely to you both now, as it should." She departed as quietly as she had arrived, leaving Draven and Lyra alone once again, in the study, where so much of their strange journey together had first begun. Outside, the pack continued its steady rhythm of daily life, strengthened by peace, hard-won, through honesty rather than conquest, led by a king who had learned, against every expectation, that the most valuable voice in his court had been standing quietly at the back of the hall all along, waiting simply for someone willing to listen. And though the curse that first brought them together had faded from something feared into something quietly treasured, neither Draven nor Lyra ever forgot the night an Alpha King halted a war council on nothing more than a stranger's honest thought, and found, in that unexpected moment, the beginning of everything that mattered most.